Welcome to Geekstorians, the show where we rummage through the cupboards of geek history and discover the strange objects we carried out into the world. I'm Dave from Geektown, and today we're exploring how toys, models, and action figures turned stories into something you could hold, swap, lose down the back of the sofa, and build entire childhoods around. This is the Plastic Empire. It's Christmas morning, 1977. The living room is warm, the tree is glowing, and tucked beneath it is a box that, to one very excited child, might as well contain the entire galaxy. They've seen Star Wars, they've talked about Star Wars, and now, finally, they get to play Star Wars. Except, the box is empty. Well, not entirely. Inside is a cardboard display stand, some stickers, a mail-in certificate, and a promise. A promise that if they post this certificate to a toy company in Cincinnati, 4 action figures will arrive in the spring.
Yay!
And somehow,
Awesome!
That's enough. More than enough. Because this is the early bird certificate package. Toy company Kenner's desperate solution to a problem nobody had ever faced before. Everybody wanted Star Wars toys, and no one had made any. They didn't sell figures, they sold anticipation. And the strange thing is just how perfectly it worked. Children clutched those empty boxes like treasures. Parents queued for the privilege of buying nothing at all. And when those figures finally arrived, Luke, Leia, R2-D2 and Chewbacca, they rather ironically started an empire, a new scale, a new kind of fandom, a new way for stories to live in our homes long after the film had ended. Because before Star Wars toys existed in reality, they existed in our imaginations. Before Star Wars detonated across toy aisles, Hollywood had a very simple philosophy about merchandise. They didn't think about it. At all. It lived somewhere between nice if it happens and, oh no, do we have to? To studios, toys were the cinematic equivalent of letting your nephew borrow the car. You handed over the keys, prayed for the best, and fully expected it to return with crisps in the footwell and a mysterious new rattle. If a film spawned a lunchbox or two, marvellous, that covered the coffee budget. But the idea that plastic could drive a franchise, that toys might one day out-earn the movie, Hollywood treated that with the same energy as a dad opening a VHS player for the first time, pressing buttons, looking confused, and quietly hoping somebody else would deal with it. If anything, toys were seen beneath the storytelling. Merchandise was something you scraped off the bottom of your boot after the premiere. Even George Lucas couldn't get major companies interested in Star Wars merchandise early on. Mattel passed. Mego passed. Most toy executives looked at his strange space opera full of robed mystics and golden robots and thought, how do you sell a character whose face is a metal bin with feelings? Hard pass. Meanwhile, over in Cincinnati, Kenner, a much smaller toy company, wasn't picky. They just liked the look of it. And that turned out to be the single greatest, sure, why not, in the history of childhood. But even Kenner didn't grasp what they were about to unleash. Because no one, not Hollywood, not toy companies, not even George Lucas, had ever seen a film create demand like this. That's what Star Wars changed. It didn't just inspire fans, it created a world people wanted to bring home. And suddenly, the logic of the entire industry flipped. A film wasn't just a film, a character wasn't just a character, a story wasn't complete without the plastic counterpart you clutched in your hand while making swooshing noises across the living room. But before we get to that revolution, we need to witness the explosion that happened next. Because once Star Wars toys actually arrived, the rest of the industry took notes. Aggressively. And this is where the real madness begins. When Star Wars toys finally hit the shelves in 1978, months after the early bird box had promised them, they didn't just sell, they vanished. Whole cases evaporated the moment a shop opened its doors. Parents queued like they were trying to get Springsteen tickets. Children developed instincts normally found in migrating birds, able to locate a Kenner display from distances that defy no mathematics and most adult navigation systems. And what arrived wasn't just a toy line, it was a format. Kenner didn't make big dolls like the old Action Man, which was the UK name for G.I. Joe if you're in the States, and they didn't make miniature die-cast ships like in the 1960s sci-fi era. They made 3.75-inch action figures. A size they chose because it meant the Millennium Falcon could fit in a child's hand and a shop shelf. And crucially, it also wouldn't require parents to take out a second mortgage. It was practical, cheap, durable, and also expandable. The scale wasn't an accident, it was a blueprint. And the thing about that size is it changed everything. Suddenly you could build a whole universe with minimal plastic and maximum imagination. Vehicles became affordable. Playsets became collectible. Every character, no matter how briefly they appeared on screen, could be immortalized as a small, rigid, armed avatar. Kenner made figures of characters who didn't even speak. Kenner made figures of characters who barely moved. Kenner made figures of background aliens who appeared for 4 seconds and then died off screen. If you breathed in the direction of a camera during Star Wars, Kenner probably prototyped you. So if you were an extra who accidentally wandered into frame, congratulations, you might now be worth 40 quid in mint condition. And the money rolled in. By the end of the 1970s, Star Wars toys were generating more revenue than the film itself. By the mid-80s, the merch had out-earned the entire original trilogy combined. The kind of financial twist Hollywood normally writes into dystopian parables, not its own accounts. And somewhere inside 20th Century Fox, the studio that financed and released the original Star Wars, a penny dropped. Possibly the most expensive penny in the history of accounting. Because back when nobody had cared about merchandise, George Lucas had negotiated his deal. He'd taken a lower directing fee, played the humble filmmaker just wanting to get his vision on screen, and in exchange, he'd walked away with the sequel rights and all merchandising rights. To Fox executives in 1976, the merch clause was harmless. To Fox executives in 1978, it looked like watching someone stroll out of the building carrying the safe, the keys, and possibly the office furniture, waving cheerfully as they went past. Lucas didn't just win the rights, he won the entire future. This was the moment Hollywood realized they'd accidentally licensed away a goldmine for the price of a sandwich and a polite handshake. But they made a vow, a sacred oath, never to let it happen again. So from this point on, merchandise wasn't an afterthought. It was the plan. And the rest of the industry began scrambling to catch up. Every studio, every network, every toy company that had once sneered at Star Wars as robots and wizards and whatever that bin-headed man is, suddenly wanted their own plastic empire. But there was a problem. Star Wars didn't just sell toys. Star Wars sold a world. And not every franchise had one of those lying around. Some barely had a coherent script, which meant the next step in the story wasn't just copying Star Wars. It was trying to manufacture the magic from scratch. By the early 1980s, everyone wanted their own Star Wars. The toys, the revenue, the cultural grip. But most franchises weren't Star Wars. Some weren't even stories. They were just vibes and a confused pitch deck. So the toy industry made a decision so bold, so audacious, so wonderfully shameless that it could only have happened in the 80s. If they couldn't find world building, they'd manufacture it. Literally. This was the moment the toy came first. And the cartoon was reverse engineered to explain why a plastic man with furry underpants carried a sword that shot lightning. The 1980s didn't give us the toy tie-in. It gave us the cartoon designed by committee to justify the toy line. And it all kicked off because of a change to the American broadcasting rules. In 1983, the United States deregulated children's television advertising. Up until then, there'd been fairly strict limits on how much a show could behave like an advert. Then the rules changed, and suddenly the 80s said, what if the show is the advert? And the FCC, in a move that historians still look at with equal parts awe and horror, essentially said, yeah, all right. And this opened the floodgates. Mego, the biggest name in action figures at the time, had famously been offered Star Wars, and in a decision that future generations would study like an archaeological tragedy, turned it down. And companies like Mattel, who'd also shrugged at the license during the early rounds, suddenly realised they'd missed the cultural equivalent of lottery numbers printed in neon. So Mattel made a choice. If you can't have the next Star Wars, build something enormous, loud, and muscular enough to compete with it. Enter He-Man. Mattel sculpted a line of heroic fantasy figures, pointed at them proudly, and effectively said, "This is He-Man. What's the story?" Yes. Then they commissioned a cartoon from Filmation, specifically to give children a reason these figures existed. Not lore, not mythology, a reason. And somehow, gloriously, it worked. He-Man and the Masters of the Universe exploded across toy aisles, like Skeletor firing a merchandising cannon powered by raw 80s ambition. Every character had a gimmick. Spinning torsos, spring-loaded arms, heads that popped off if you looked at them funny. The cartoon was essentially 22 minutes of introducing a new character, showcasing their gimmick, and politely reminding children that they might want to own it. But that established the model. The toy line didn't follow the show followed the toy line. Of course, while the toy industry was busy flooding one side of the aisle with swords, robots, and explosions, the other side of the aisle had a very specific label on it: girls' toys. And for decades, that had meant one thing: dolls, fashion, domestic play, and an unspoken assumption that girls didn't want action, they wanted accessories.
And ponies and dolls.
But the success of He-Man quietly challenged that idea. Because if boys were happy to buy figures driven by story, power, and fantasy, why wouldn't girls? Mattel's answer arrived in 1985.
For the honor of Grayskull!
She-Ra, Princess of Power. She-Ra wasn't a side character, she wasn't a spin-off curiosity. She was a full-blown hero. Sword, transformation sequence, villains, mythology, and stakes. Yes, the aesthetic was different, yes, there were a few more sparkles, but the structure was the same. World building, ongoing narrative, a toy line engineered to support an epic cartoon. And girls responded. She-Ra proved that action storytelling wasn't gendered, only the packaging was. And then came Gem and the Holograms, which did something even stranger. It combined music, sci-fi technology, secret identities, rival factions, and serialized drama, all wrapped in neon hair and synth pop. It wasn't just a doll line, it was world building with guitars. By the mid-80s, the lesson was obvious. Even if the industry didn't fully admit it yet, kids didn't want toys, they wanted worlds they could belong to. And the cartoon toy machine would never look at the aisle the same way again. The next thing to come along was Transformers, a franchise stitched together from two Japanese toy lines, Diaclone and Microman, which Hasbro repackaged, renamed, and handed to Marvel Comics with the instructions, "Please invent personalities for our pile of robot limbs." Marvel writers stared at the toys and essentially said, fine, they're alien robots, they crash-landed, some are good, some are evil, someone shout roll out, we're done. The result? An absolute phenomenon. Hasbro went to revive G.I. Joe in the US, changing the larger doll to a 3.75-inch figure line, shamelessly adopting Kenner's Star Wars scale. And it then launched a cartoon so patriotic it could probably salute, recite the Constitution, and do push-ups all at the same time. In the UK, that line arrived as Action Force, where British kids gleefully ignored whatever backstory America had written and used them to fight whatever other figures they had lying around. The format worked everywhere. The next big players, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Interestingly, renamed Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles in the UK because the BBC decided ninja was too dangerous a word for children, but mutant apparently was fine.
Dude.
They smashed onto the screen in 1987. Playmates Toys commissioned the cartoon specifically to launch the toy line, and the range became a juggernaut. But here's the twist though, before the toys, Turtles were not kid-friendly at all. They began life as a black and white indie comic book, which was gritty, violent, and satirical. The kind of thing you'd hand to a 7-year-old only if you wanted them to ask very complicated questions about vigilantism and reptile-based martial arts. Playmates, upon seeing this grimy underground comic, essentially said, "Perfect, let's make it adorable." Also, Michelangelo's nunchucks were censored in Britain, spinning off-screen like they joined witness protection, but the toy remained gloriously uncensored and aggressively plastic. It didn't matter, the formula was bulletproof. Bright characters, catchy theme song, toy aisle frenzy. And while all this toy-fueled creativity was exploding across Saturday mornings, there was another reaction brewing. Because the 1980s didn't just give us deregulated cartoons and neon plastic heroes. It gave us adults who looked at these toys and thought, hang on, this seems a bit dangerous. This was, of course, the era of moral panics, and not just the Dungeons and Dragons kind, which we covered in detail back in episode 7. This was a broader cultural movement when some parents, church groups, and newspaper columnists became convinced that children's toys were part of a vast, brightly coloured conspiracy. Incredibly, He-Man, for example, was accused, in all sincerity, of promoting paganism. Not violence, not consumerism, paganism. Because apparently the mere act of shouting, "I have the power," was enough to make certain commentators worried that little Timmy was one day away from founding his own woodland solstice ritual.
Think of the children.
Meanwhile, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles were scrutinised for martial arts corruption. Transformers were quietly side-eyed for Eastern mysticism.
Roll out.
Thundercats at one point were accused of containing subliminal occult symbolism, which quite honestly feels like an overreaction to a cartoon cat yelling, "Ho!" Meanwhile, most kids were just trying to figure out why their action figures' legs kept falling off.
Damn it.
But this was the atmosphere toys existed in. A booming creativity surrounded by adults nervously poking plastic figurines as they thought they might start chanting. Which brings us to the next escalation. Because once the panic had died down, the toy industry didn't slow. It got very competitive. Alongside the Turtles and Thundercats came Mask, Silverhawks, Visionaries, Centurions, an entire generation of shows powered by plastic, neon, and sheer corporate enthusiasm. The 80s devolved into a glorious, incoherent arms race of toy-first storytelling. Some shows were good, some were baffling, some felt like they were made purely to explain why a toy came with a vehicle, a grappling hook, a jetpack, and a suspiciously cheerful animal sidekick. But they all shared one truth. They weren't telling stories, they were building toy ecosystems. And for the first time since Star Wars, children didn't just watch with words, they expanded them. And once the toy cartoon machine was running at full speed, the next step was inevitable. The rise of the collector, the birth of scarcity, and the moment adults realized they wanted toys just as much as the kids did, maybe even more. By the late 80s, something unexpected started happening. Children still love toys, passionately, loudly, and usually on the floor where parents tripped over them. But now adults were quietly joining in. Not adults buying toys for their kids, adults buying toys for themselves. The action figures had evolved from a plaything into a collectible, a tiny plastic investment portfolio with questionable liquidity and enormous emotional return. And like all great cultural shifts, it begins with scarcity. Star Wars figures had already proven that some toys were rarer than others. A slight paint variant here, a misprinted card there, a character who appeared on screen for a fraction of a second. Suddenly these were items of value. People who'd once mocked plastic junk were now storing them carefully in attics, whispering the phrase "mint on card" as if it was a religious invocation.
We'll be rich.
You couldn't just own a figure anymore, you had to preserve it. the cardboard backing becoming sacred, the bubble becoming a force field. Removing a figure from its packaging became an act akin to opening the Ark of the Covenant. You could do it, sure, but people would look at you like your face might melt off any second. By the early 90s, speculation fever hit the toy market the same way it hit comics. Magazines listed prices. Shops opened that sold toys in protective cases. Adults queued for variants, exclusives, special editions, figures with slightly different eyebrows, any perceived rarity that could potentially be a goldmine. Some toys did skyrocket in value. Most did not. But hope is a powerful currency, and plastic was its newest asset class. And then everything took a leap forward, thanks to one man. Enter Todd McFarlane, comic artist, iconoclast, and owner of a brain that looked at toys and thought, what if these were cool?
Oh, yeah.
In 1994, McFarlane founded McFarlane Toys, and the collector world would never be the same. His figures weren't simple childhood relics. They were detailed, sculpted, borderline gothic works of art, with more spikes than a hedgehog. These toys weren't meant to be played with. They were meant to be displayed, admired, debated, protected from dust at all costs. McFarlane didn't invent the adult collector, but he gave them a cathedral. Suddenly every franchise, Spawn, Movie Maniacs, Kiss, The Crow, horror icons, sports stars, had premium figures aimed squarely at adults with disposable income and an unwavering belief that shelving was a personality trait. And the industry noticed. By the late 90s, toy companies realised adults would pay more for better sculpts, sharper paint apps, and packaging that didn't immediately disintegrate if you looked at it funny. So toy aisles began splitting in two. The colourful chaos of kids' toys and the darker, moodier collector's section, where figures stared out at you from shelves like brooding demigods trapped in transparent prisons. And this led to something unforeseen. Adults didn't just collect figures, they started hunting them. Collector culture birthed rituals, early morning toy runs, message boards trading sightings like rare wildlife, the crushing anguish of arriving 2 minutes too late. For the first time since the 70s, toys have become a cultural frontier, a place where identity, nostalgia, scarcity, and bragging rights collided. But plastic wasn't done evolving yet, because the next chapter wasn't about children or adult collectors. It was about worlds, universes that toys helped build. The empire was only getting bigger. By the late 90s, something subtle had shifted again. Collectors weren't just preserving toys. Children weren't just playing with them. Toys were becoming platforms. They weren't simply objects you bought, they were entry points into entire universes you could build, customize, remix, and expand. And nowhere was that clearer than in the little Danish plastic brick company, Lego. They once offered you exactly 3 narrative settings: town, space, castle. That was it. If you were a kid in the 80s, your options were basically medieval knight, lunar astronaut, or man with tiny plastic briefcase. Then something changed. Lego realised that the stories children wanted to tell increasingly came from the worlds they loved on screen. Star Wars, Harry Potter, superheroes, giant robots, blockbusters of every shape and colour. And after a great deal of hesitation and more than a few internal arguments, Lego eventually embraced that shift. Suddenly you could build the Millennium Falcon brick by brick. You could recreate Hogwarts on your bedroom floor. You could construct Batman's gadgets, Spider-Man's skyline, the DeLorean from Back to the Future, the TARDIS, Ghostbusters Ecto-1. Entire universes rendered in joyful, studded plastic. Lego didn't just make sets, they made translation devices. A way for stories to leap from screen to physical reality. And the licensing floodgates opened. For a generation like me who grew up squinting at their mismatched bricks trying to kit bash a spaceship that vaguely resembled the Millennium Falcon, this was world-changing. Now, Lego wasn't a neutral creative tool. It was a multiverse. And yet Lego was only one side of this new evolution, the everybody builds side. On the other side was something far more specialised. While Western toy companies were embracing licensed universes, Japan had already mastered an entirely different approach. Toys that you didn't just play with, you built, customised, panel-lined, airbrushed, snapped, poised, photographed, displayed, and occasionally worshipped. Gunpla, Gundam plastic model kits, turned fandom into craftsmanship. Gunpla wasn't passive consumption, it was participation. You weren't just buying a mobile suit, you were assembling it, articulating it, making it yours. Model kits ranged from simple beginner builds to monstrous, intricate projects that required tools, patience, and a degree of emotional stability that many fans did not possess. Gunpla didn't just influence model building, it influenced collecting, display culture, and the idea that a toy could be a long-term project rather than an instant gratification hit. It also taught an entire generation of fans to take pride in the act of creation, sanding edges, painting details, upgrading joints, applying decals with the care of a jeweler working under a microscope. In Western toy culture, toys were stories you received. In Gunpla, toys were stories you authored. If Gunpla turned fandom into craftsmanship, then Warhammer turned it into a fully fledged lifestyle. Where Gundam let you build a single mobile suit, Warhammer asked you to build an army. Although army could mean elves, dwarves, orcs, space marines, demons, chaos beasts, or whatever else Games Workshop sculpted from metal during that particular lunar cycle. And yes, back then they were very much metal. Weighty, stabby, capable of both tabletop warfare and minor blunt force trauma.
Ow.
Born in the UK in the 1980s, Warhammer and Warhammer 40,000 blended model building, miniature painting, tabletop strategy, and lore so dense you could insulate a loft with it. These weren't action figures, these were commitments. Superglue, brushes, colour schemes, basing grit, and a prayer to the gods of Citadel paint that you wouldn't glue your fingers together. And Games Workshop, knowingly or not, built a business model so clever it could be studied alongside agricultural irrigation systems and ancient Roman taxation. Many stores, including the one I frequented as a teen, ran weekend leagues or campaign days, often right in the middle of the shop. It was genius. Players got a place to battle, and the shop got a steady stream of excited customers watching the game unfold like a live advert with dice. But the real stroke of brilliance came in the campaign rules. In one Chaos League, if your hero won a battle, you roll on a mutation table. Extra arms, a horn, steel skin, a demonic limb, something deeply weird sprouting from somewhere best left unexamined. Fantastic for storytelling, terrible for your wallet. Because if your miniature now had, say, 2 extra arms, you had to represent that on the model before next week's match. And Games Workshop didn't sell mutation kits or extra limbs, so you had to go and buy another figure. You went home, surgically removed its limbs, glued them onto your hero, repainted everything while high on superglue fumes, and returned triumphantly with your newly hideous champion. It was glorious, it was manipulative, and it was the perfect synergy of creativity, community, and commerce. Warhammer didn't just give you toys, it gave you a hobbyist universe, a world that grew as fast as your imagination, your painting skills, and your disposable income would allow. Between LEGO's licensed multiverse, Gunpla's model building artistry, and Warhammer's Chaos Leagues, a new idea took hold. The value of a toy wasn't just the toy, it was the world it connected you to, the creativity it unlocked, the time you invested in it, the community it made you part of. Toys were no longer just an extension of stories, they were ecosystems. And as the millennium arrived, something else began to happen. Toys and collectibles weren't just confined to physical shelves anymore. They started mutating into digital worlds, online fandom spaces, and entirely new forms of imagined play. But before we reach the modern era of virtual toys, collectibles, and other things, there's one more leap to make. Because the 2010s didn't just reinvent toys, they reinvented nostalgia. By the 2010s, something strange had happened. Toys had migrated. They were no longer confined to bedrooms, toy chests, and the occasional boardroom desk belonging to a suspiciously whimsical CEO. They were moving into living rooms, onto display shelves, across entire walls. They'd become decor, identity, aesthetic. This was the age of the pop culture shrine. It began innocently enough. A small vinyl figure with a giant head. Cute, harmless, possibly watching you. Funko Pops arrived with the quiet energy of a novelty gift and the expansion rate of invasive bamboo. You buy one, then you buy two. Then suddenly your bookshelf looks like Comic-Con is nesting in your house. Funko didn't sell characters. Funko sold permission. Permission for adults to display fandom as interior design. They made pops for everything. Marvel heroes, sitcom characters, obscure anime villains, that one background alien from that one episode of that one thing. If it existed, pretty much anywhere, Funko would turn it into a figure with the same wide, mildly alarming expression, like it had just remembered that it had left the oven on. For collectors, it was bliss. For anybody who's a minimalist, it was a cry for help. But Funko wasn't alone. As pop spread, other companies realised adults wanted toys with presence, premium sculpts, retro throwbacks, hyper-detailed monsters, nostalgia with articulation. Suddenly you had NECA recreating horror icons down to the last splatter, Super 7 resurrecting 80s toy lines like ancient deities, and Hasbro Pulse turning action figures into luxury items with better packaging than most electronics. These weren't toys for children. These were display pieces, figures posed on floating shelves, miniature dioramas set up with museum-level lighting, people proudly posting selfies, photos of their meticulously organised collectibles, the way others posed wedding photographs. It wasn't a hobby, it was interior design world building. And then toys mutated again, this time into the digital world. Skins in video games, cosmetic items in online worlds, emotes, animations, premium drops, all functionally toys, just without the risk of stepping on them in the middle of the night. For younger fans, owning a limited edition Fortnite skin carried the same weight as owning a limited edition action figure. Scarcity, value, identity, all intact, just intangible. Toys had become data with swagger, and toy companies noticed. Physical toy lines began borrowing digital logic. Variants, exclusives, chase figures, limited production runs, premium pricing for premium nostalgia. Everything old was new again, just much more expensive. And somewhere between the physical toys and the digital skins, another shift crept in. Collecting stopped being about what you bought and started being about what you might get. Enter the blind box, the sealed packet, the mystery bag, the figure you couldn't see until you opened it. Lego minifigures, LOL surprise balls, trading card packs, tiny plastic capsules promising excitement, rarity, and just a chance at the one you really wanted. It felt playful, harmless, a bit of fun. But the mechanic was familiar. You weren't buying a toy anymore, you were buying the roll of a dice. Sometimes you won, sometimes you didn't. And the thrill wasn't the figure itself, it was the moment of the reveal. That same logic migrated into video games. Loot boxes, skin drops, randomized rewards. The toy industry hadn't copied gaming. Gaming had inherited a lesson toys have been teaching for decades. Scarcity plus randomness equals obsession. For kids, it was excitement. For companies, it was repeat purchases. For parents, it was the growing suspicion that something had changed, that collecting now came with odds. It wasn't exactly evil, but it wasn't accidental either. It marked the moment the plastic empire stopped just selling worlds and started selling chance. And once collecting became about chance rather than choice, something else started to disappear. Because somewhere along the way, the toy aisles started to vanish. For a generation of kids, especially Gen Xers and Millennials, Toys R Us wasn't just a shop, it was a destination. A warehouse-sized wonderland where aisles stretched into infinity, shelves towering above you, and the sheer scale of it made toys feel endless. You didn't go in with a plan, you wandered, you discovered, you stood frozen, overwhelmed, trying to decide which part of your imagination to prioritize. It was a physical experience, bright lights, plastic smells, demo stations, boxes you weren't allowed to open but stared at anyway. And then it was gone. Toys R Us collapsed in the US and in the UK, and with it went something more than just a retailer. It marked the end of browsing as a shared childhood ritual. No more wandering aisles, no more accidental discoveries, no more standing in front of a wall of possibility paralysed by choice. In its place came algorithms, search bars, targeted recommendations. Efficiency, convenience, soulless. So adults built their own toy aisles instead. Shelves at home, display walls, carefully curated collections that recreated that feeling of standing in the toy store. Only this time it was personal. The shrine wasn't just about fandom, it was about rebuilding a space that no longer existed. And that loss, the quiet disappearance of the toy aisle, is why the plastic empire didn't fade. And when the aisles disappeared, something else began to change too. Not how toys were sold, but who got to decide what they looked like. For decades, the plastic empire had worked one way. Companies designed the toys, and fans waited. Waited for announcements, for waves, for variants, for restocks, for permission. But quietly, almost unnoticed, the factory doors started opening. Not in China, not in warehouses, but in spare rooms, garages, and kitchen counters. Home 3D printers changed the equation. Suddenly, fans weren't just collecting figures, they were making them. Sculpting characters that didn't exist, fixing sculpts that companies got wrong, printing replacement parts, custom heads, alternate weapons, entire armies. With resin printers, a laptop, and enough patience to tolerate the smell, people could recreate miniatures that rivaled and sometimes surpassed official releases. The plastic empire had taught fans how to care deeply about detail, about scale, about accuracy. 3D printing simply handed them the tools. This wasn't piracy in the old sense. It was participation taken to its logical extreme. From waiting to building to printing. From consumer to creator. When you zoom out far enough, the history of toys looks less like an industry and more like a language, a way we translate imagination into something we can touch. That's what the plastic empire really is. It isn't just Star Wars shelves or 80s cartoons or Lego multiverses or rows of gently panicking Funko Pops. It's the story of how we learnt to take our worlds with us, to build them, to remix them, to collect them, to anchor memories to them. And it all leads back to that empty box in 1977, a box that promised 4 figures and accidentally invented an entire economy. A box of anticipation, a box of imagination, a box that said, the story doesn't end when the film does, you get to keep it. From that moment on, toys weren't ornamental, they were participatory. Children turned films into worlds on carpets and kitchen tables. Teenagers turned metal miniatures into armies and chaos mutations. Adults turned shelves into fandom mosaics. Fans turned plastic into identity, ritual, art, community. Tiny monuments to the stories that mattered to them. We don't love toys because they're plastic, we love them because they're portals. A doorway back to childhood. A bridge to our favourite characters. A spark for creativity. A reminder that imagination doesn't retire when we grow up. It just starts collecting. The plastic empire isn't really about consumerism. It's about connection to stories, to each other, to the version of ourselves who once held a toy and saw a galaxy. And if a small, empty box on a Christmas morning can reshape the world, maybe the things we dismiss as just toys can carry much more than we think. I'm Dave from Geektown, and this has been Geekstorians. If this episode sparked a few memories or made you glance nervously at your own shelves, just make sure you're subscribed or follow the show wherever you listen, so you don't miss out on what we uncover next. And you can find every episode over at geektown.co.uk, along with our weekly Geektown radio show covering the latest TV, film and gaming news. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time.